All right, let's keep going with Mathieu Pajot's chapter 3, returning to the Garden of Eden. God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the humans he had formed. From a strictly materialistic perspective, science has debunked most of the traditional cosmology. Now, those of you who are sort of following along with the playlist of this series know that I just read Lewis's epilogue from The Discarded Image, and that pertains to this. Science has debunked the traditional cosmology only if you imagine the traditional cosmology was doing the same thing that science does now. As Lewis pointed out, the traditional cosmology withdrew, but really one might argue that, well, the science sort of came along to support its withdrawal, and that the moving it aside was happening for really other reasons before then. And again, it doesn't mean that the science is wrong. The story, the subtraction story, that, well, and again, as Lewis said, it's not that you can't make a geocentric model work. It's the math is better for a heliocentric model. And so that's the model we use, as well it should be. So from a strictly materialist perspective, and even that phrase, a materialist perspective doesn't really impact the math of the model itself, because a materialist perspective includes a whole lot more than the model can possibly hold. However, as discussed in the previous chapter, the highest level of biblical interpretation has been left intact by scientific discovery. And what I think he means here is the Big Bang. And as I've said in previous videos, I've spent a lot of time hearing certain kinds of often American evangelicals decrying the Big Bang when, well, it was a Christian who postulated it, and others confirmed it, and it became scientific knowledge. But even that has, well, there's the multiverse, and we can't leave the Big Bang alone because, well, as we'll get into, what the Big Bang does not address is where do the laws of physics come from? And, well, I believe in the laws of physics. Well, how did those laws get set? Why do we call them laws? Lewis points that out often. Moreover, this level is only one that truly matters from a spiritual perspective. And again, all of my comments on a spiritual perspective. What on earth do you mean by that? Because it fully encapsulates the meaning of humanity within creation. Again, the Big Bang continues to leave God in charge. And as Jordan Peterson and many others have noted, you kind of say, well, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest, because can you explain the Big Bang? Can you get before it? Well, they're trying like crazy, but it's hard. Surely we must be able to find evidence for it. And again, look at my video on the epilogue of C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. Unfortunately, the higher levels of interpretation have been marginalized in recent times because of the scientific ability to explain phenomena exclusively in terms of matter and mechanical causality. And again, I would lean on Lewis's showing that is one really causing the other, or is the science sort of supporting the assertion? Nevertheless, it is a mistake to interpret the Bible using a scientific model of the universe instead of its own cosmological perspective, no matter how archaic it may appear to modern sensibilities. Now this is really rather difficult, because the Bible certainly makes assertions, but the Bible doesn't really explain itself in the ways that its presumed audience, the writers would presume its audience would assume. And so when we try to get a sense of, well, what did the audience have in mind, we're somewhat in the middle of this pickle that Lewis talks about in Horrid Red Things. Lewis made the point that we sort of navigate these things by mental pictures. And the more mathematical the models get, the less we actually can manage them by our pictures. And so, the real picture that we have of, let's say, the workings of the San Francisco Bay come from visiting the Bay Area model in Sausalito, California. Go ahead and Google it. You can find pictures of it. It's a really cool place. And if you're in the Bay Area, I highly recommend giving it a little visit. It's quite something. And they'll let you in there and walk around. It's really quite marvelous. But the computer models we use, well, there's a reason we have them on computers, and coders, might tinker with the code. But, I was watching AI playing video games and the development of robotics on Sunday with Rick. Increasingly, we're having the software write itself. So not only don't we really grasp the computer models that are telling us that an atmospheric river is coming this way in California, but we can't picture it. So Lewis makes the point here in Horrid Red Things. In these examples, the mental image is not unlike the reality. And remember, Lewis talks about, a scale boat and a boat, or the Sausalito Bay model, and then the bay itself is not unlike the reality, but is known to be unlike it, at least after a moment's reflection. I know that London is not merely Euston Station. Let us now go on a slightly different predicament. Once I heard a lady tell her young daughter that you would die if you ate too many tablets of aspirin. But why? Asked the child. It isn't poisonous. How do you know it isn't poisonous? Said the mother. Because, said the child, when you crush an aspirin tablet, you don't find horrid red things inside. Clearly, when this child thought of poison, she had a mental picture of horrid red things, just as I have a mental picture of Euston when I think of London. The difference is that whereas I know my image to be very much unlike the real London, the child thought that the poison was really red. To that extent, she was mistaken. But this does not mean that everything she thought or said about poison was necessarily nonsensical. She knew perfectly well that a poison was something which killed you or made you ill if you swallowed it, and she knew to some extent which of the substances in her mother's house were poisonous. If a visitor to the house had been warned by the child, "Don't drink that, mother says it's poison," he would have been ill-advised to neglect the warning on the ground that this child has a primitive idea of poison as horrid red things, which my adult scientific knowledge has long since refuted. This gets to the point of all of this grasping that we're doing. So the point that Peugeot is making here in the book is that, somewhat like the child who had some imaginings about how the world worked, she also has knowledge about how the world worked, and we might call that parabolic knowledge, and that in fact was true knowledge. And now what we often try to do with the Bible is sort of get behind some of the things that we don't understand. For example, the Old Testament dietary laws and a prohibition on pig, and far later we found trichinosis, and so we say, it's quite clear that what the dietary laws were doing was affording Israel a healthier thing. This is sort of horrid red thing science. And now that anthropology has come along, a lot of anthropologists, like Mary Douglas, for example, will say, no, that's not really what that stuff was about. And while it might have been good advice to keep the camp free of animal feces, their ideas of clean and unclean were really reaching towards other things that go far beyond sort of a primitive germ theory. And so this is part of what we bump into when we try to read the Bible, because we can't help but read our models onto the Bible. And what the Bible is thinking, is actually quite different. Now I'm thinking I'm going to have to release the Bookwave video before I release this one, because we had some really wonderful examples of that as I was talking to them. Because on one hand, this one individual that grew up going to Sunday school in the Baptist church and, left all of that and has gone his own way. Now when he reads the Bible, there's sort of latent, it's worried about the supernatural things. And so then I asked him, what about the things you're reading in the Iliad and the Odyssey? Well, that's different. Well, why? And then I brought in Tom Holland, and, the Greeks didn't have a religion, and neither did the Hebrews. Well, then exactly how were they working? And this is where John Walton comes in and says to his readers, y'all are looking in Genesis 1 for a material origins of the world. It seems to me, an evangelical Old Testament scholar, that what we're really looking at is sort of a structural functional description and not a material description. Well, why do we keep looking for material descriptions? And now we're back to Lewis's point in the epilogue. Oh, it's because we've already gotten here and presupposed that material causality is that which moves the world. And Mathieu Pajot's, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep saying that because I don't know that I'm saying it right. I would almost rather just call him Matthew, anglicize it. What should I do? His point is, yeah. But then we're kind of stuck in where Lewis goes with this also, that Barfield's point that wind and spirit are the same thing to the people who write this. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily thought that wind and spirit were the same thing when we say it. And, this gets back into the question, when we read Plato, are we really sort of thinking his thoughts after him? Can we actually do that? And now, again, if you go back to my video about being honest in church, what does this mean for those of us who are trying to relate to God through this book? That when we read it, well, we're projecting our science onto it. And we've been doing that for a couple hundred years. And Pajot, both of them are really coming to us and saying, you're probably going to have to stop that. And in fact, Jordan Peterson's coming to us and saying, actually, if we read it psychologically, I'm finding some concordance between the psychology of the world and the Bible. In other words, Jordan Peterson basically comes into the Genesis 3 stories and doesn't find a material process that yields humanity, but finds a psychological process that yields humanity evidenced in the text. And then suddenly when people hear that, well, they start thinking in different terms. Admittedly, interpreting the Bible with its own cosmology is a difficult task because our current worldview has little in common with the ancient perspective. Yeah, and not only do we have to sort of read between the lines to get the ancient perspective, even if we think we've got a grasp on it, sort of like Lewis makes the point, well, I see this map and this travel guide of ancient thought. Can I really see the world through an ancient's eyes? And this is where things get scary, because can I really understand the Bible? And as a Christian pastor, I don't want to kick up this sand and say, no, you can't, because I also believe that, well, there's continuity of the living God. And for this reason, I don't really have a big problem with people misreading the Bible and still being Christians. Now, they might have a lot of other wrong answers that I disagree with, but that doesn't mean I don't believe they're relating to the creator of the universe or having some really important understanding of the story of Christianity and the kinds of things it asserts. And it's for this reason that I think, again, I often find fundamentalists have greater faith than modernists, even if modernists understand some of these issues correctly. And that just points to our model that, to really know Christianity, you need degrees in Latin and Greek and archaeology and. Well, I haven't really found that to be true. The huge discrepancy was inevitable because we arrived at it by artificially warping our natural perceptions with telescopes and microscopes. I don't know if I'd say warping. We're expanding, but there is a warping that goes on with it, because when you look through a telescope and see the moon in your mind, like Euston Station or the horrid red things, is now a little bit different from the moon in your mind when you saw it with your natural eyes. Or perhaps the moon in the mind of the blind cousin who has never been able to see the moon with his natural eyes. At this point, humanity has opened its eyes to such an extent that our conception of space and time corresponds to the point of view of an alien robot gazing at our solar system from a faraway region. And again, if you go to the Museum of Science in the Golden Gate, those little cluster of museums in the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, you see all of these models, and we say, ah, yes, that picture I had of the biblical cosmology, that was wrong. The solar system looks like this. It really doesn't look like that. How does the solar system look? Look up in the sky. And someone says, oh, that there is Jupiter. Well, that doesn't look like those big pictures that we have from the satellites and the probes that we send out that sent back those glorious pictures of Jupiter. Does Jupiter look like that little white shining speck in the sky, or is Jupiter sort of this giant yellowish ball with storms on it sometimes, with moons that go around? What does Jupiter look like? Well, it depends where you're standing. And if you're just going to stand a few million miles away from the planet itself, well, what are you going to be standing on? But that's sort of what we're thinking imaginatively when we see the picture. We're just not paying any attention that all of the stuff we're seeing the picture through. And of course, that picture itself has a good deal of relevance realization, because if somehow you were to take a rocket and it plunked you out in space, you wouldn't see it for very long. So there's a lot going on here. To rediscover the biblical point of view, we must pretend that our eyes are not geared with thousands of telescopes or microscopes, and in fact, our minds are not geared by computer-generated models, and that we care little for quasars and quarks. Moreover, we will need to reposition ourselves within space and time by looking past the heliocentric and geocentric viewpoints towards an ancient cosmology. We're going to have to imagine. We're going to have to use some parabolic knowledge. This archaic worldview may be described as tree-centric or dendrocentric, for lack of a better word. We will temporarily adopt this perspective to rediscover ancient biblical cosmology, the logos of the cosmos, that's what cosmology is, and to reclaim its metaphysical, the stuff beyond the physics, foundations. So that's chapter 3.